The stars stretched endlessly, cold and silent as the iron tide advanced. The vast fleet moved like a living wall of steel and fire, its countless ships glowing with power. It was a sight that had broken the courage of entire civilizations. Against such a force no one had ever stood, and yet there was the Dauntless, a single human vessel floating quietly in the dark. To the eyes of the Empire's admirals, it looked insignificant. Its hull carried no ornate design, no flashing banners, no display of greatness. It was small compared to their grand warships, so ordinary it almost seemed unworthy of notice. But it did not run, and that alone made it strange. On the bridge of the Dauntless, Commander Elias Kane stood at the central console. His face was calm, but his crew could see the fire in his eyes. He studied the glowing screen before him, showing the massive wave of ships approaching. Each red dot represented an enemy, and there were so many that the display almost turned solid. His second officer, a young woman named Lyra, spoke with disbelief in her voice. "There must be thousands of them, Commander. Maybe more. We're one ship, just one. How can we—" Kane raised his hand gently to silence her. "We are not here to fight them on their terms. If we try to match their strength, we lose. If we try to outlast them, we lose. But if we think differently, if we use what they cannot predict, then maybe we win." His words gave no false comfort, but they carried a steady confidence that reached the crew. They had followed Kane this far, and they would follow him now, even into the impossible. The Dauntless had been built in secret, a project born from human desperation. While the Empire believed humanity to be weak and simple, scattered across minor colonies, there had been those who planned for a day like this. Engineers, scientists, and dreamers had worked in silence, crafting technologies that no other species had dared to attempt. They had placed those inventions into the Dauntless, not as a symbol of pride, but as humanity's last card to play. The ship was equipped with experimental phase engines, allowing it to bend space for short bursts, vanishing from one point and reappearing in another. Its weaponry was small but precise, built to strike where it hurt the most: engines, reactors, control systems. And its defense was not heavy armor or strong shields, but adaptability, a constant flow of shifting codes and countermeasures that made it hard for enemy targeting systems to lock on. Still, the crew knew this was not enough on its own. Against a single warship, the Dauntless could triumph. Against a dozen, perhaps it could survive. But against thousands? That was madness, yet Kane believed. Not in luck, not in miracles, but in the power of the human mind. The ability to think in ways the Empire would never expect. The first wave of Imperial ships drew closer, their weapons glowing with deadly energy. On the enemy flagship, the High Admiral sneered. "End this quickly," he ordered. "Show them the futility of defiance." Dozens of cruisers surged forward, their guns blazing. Beams of light cut through space, moving at impossible speed. But the Dauntless was no easy target. With a sudden command from Kane, the ship flickered out of sight, the stars bending around it as the phase engines roared. In the next instant, it reappeared behind the attacking formation. "Fire!" Kane ordered. The Dauntless unleashed its strike. Tiny bursts of energy shot across the darkness, hitting the enemy ships not on their thick armored hulls but on their weak points: engines, shield generators, weapon cores. One by one, the cruisers stuttered and failed. Some lost power entirely, drifting helplessly. Others exploded in brilliant flashes of light, torn apart from the inside. The Empire's admirals sat in stunned silence. For the first time in centuries, their ships had been destroyed by a smaller foe. On the Dauntless, the crew cheered, but Kane did not smile. He knew this was only the beginning. "Don't celebrate yet," he said. "They'll adapt, and when they do, we must be faster." As the crippled cruisers drifted, the second wave of enemy ships closed in. This time they spread out, trying to encircle the Dauntless. They launched swarms of fighters, tiny but deadly, each armed with missiles capable of piercing heavy armor. "Brace for swarm attack," Lyra shouted. The space around the Dauntless filled with moving lights as the fighters dove in. But Kane was ready. "Deploy adaptive drones," he commanded. From the belly of the human ship, small metallic orbs shot out. At first they seemed harmless, drifting aimlessly. But as the fighters approached, the drones activated, scanning enemy weapons and adjusting in real time. They formed shifting patterns, intercepting missiles, confusing targeting systems, and even striking back with sharp bursts of energy. The swarm faltered. Fighters spun out of control, colliding with each other. Missiles exploded harmlessly in empty space, and through the chaos the Dauntless slipped once more into phase drive, disappearing before the enemy could close the trap. On the Imperial flagship, the Admiral slammed his fist against the console. "This is impossible. One human ship cannot do this." But it was happening. The battle raged on, and every time the Empire tried to use its numbers, the Dauntless broke their formation. Every time they attempted a new strategy, Kane outthought them. The crew of the human ship worked tirelessly, adjusting drones, recalibrating weapons, and managing the unstable engines that bent space itself. Hours passed, and the once proud formation of the Iron Tide began to look less like a wall and more like scattered fragments. Hundreds of ships had been lost or disabled. Fear began to spread among the crews of the Empire. For the first time in their service, they whispered the unthinkable. What if we cannot win? On the Dauntless, the crew felt exhaustion pressing down on them, but Kane's voice kept them steady. Remember why we fight. Every second we hold, our people survive. Every ship we bring down, we prove humanity cannot be broken. The humans had no reinforcements, no great empire behind them. They were only themselves, a single ship in the face of a storm. Yet somehow they were turning the tide. By the end of that first clash, as the stars grew dim with the wreckage of countless vessels, a new legend had begun to form. Across the Empire's communication channels, a single message spread like fire. One human ship is defying the Iron Tide, and on distant worlds, far beyond the battlefield, other species began to listen. The wreckage of destroyed warships drifted across the silent void. Sparks and shattered metal floated in the cold darkness, silent reminders of the impossible. One human vessel had broken the Empire's perfect record. For centuries, the Iron Tide had been unstoppable. Entire civilizations had surrendered at the sight of its arrival. And yet here was the Dauntless, a ship so small and plain compared to the mighty Imperial Armada, fighting and surviving. On the bridge of the flagship, the High Admiral stared at the tactical display. Red icons representing Imperial ships blinked out one by one. His golden eyes narrowed with fury. "This is unacceptable," he said coldly. "No single ship can humiliate the Iron Tide. Increase the assault. Crush them." Orders rippled through the fleet. New formations shifted into place. Hundreds of ships prepared their weapons. Waves of fighters swarmed out once more, filling the stars with motion. The Empire would not allow this resistance to continue. But aboard the Dauntless, Commander Elias Kane stood calm at the center of the storm. His crew looked to him with anxious eyes, but his voice was steady, sharp as steel. "They believe strength alone will win this fight," he said. "Let us prove them wrong." The crew straightened, their fear slowly turning into determination. They had already achieved the unthinkable, surviving the first onslaught of the Iron Tide. Now Kane intended to do more. He intended to strike at the very heart of their arrogance. "Target their destroyers," Kane ordered. "Not the strongest ships, not the weakest. The ones in the middle. Break their chain of command." The Dauntless roared to life. Its engines flared, bending space with a sudden shimmer. In a blink, the ship vanished from its position and reappeared behind a cluster of destroyers. Before the enemy could react, the Dauntless opened fire. Its weapons were not designed for overwhelming blasts, but for precision. Streams of energy lanced forward, striking at exact points. The first destroyer's reactor overloaded, tearing the ship apart in a brilliant flash. Another lost its shields, leaving it exposed as its hull cracked under pressure. A third spun helplessly as its engines failed, colliding with a nearby cruiser. The fleet's formation wavered. Alarms echoed across the enemy ships. For the first time, Imperial officers found themselves on the defensive. On the Dauntless, the crew moved with flawless coordination. Lyra monitored enemy patterns, shouting adjustments. The engineers pushed the unstable engines to their limits, even as sparks flew across their panels. The adaptive drones, still floating in the battlefield, shifted their programming, intercepting incoming fire. Kane's eyes never left the display. Every move, every strike was carefully calculated. He did not waste energy firing at heavy armor. He did not aim for glorious explosions. He struck at the joints of the machine, the weak points of a massive beast, and it worked. Ship after ship fell, not to raw power, but to cleverness. The Empire had prepared for fleets, for armies, for sieges, but it had never prepared for an enemy that refused to play by its rules. In the command chamber of the flagship, Frustration turned into something worse: unease. The Admiral clenched his fists, his voice sharp as a blade. "Why can't we hit them? Why can't we lock on? It's one ship." A junior officer, trembling, replied, They vanish before we can fire, Admiral. Their technology, it is unlike anything we've seen. Our systems cannot predict their jumps." The Admiral's voice turned dark. "Then we overwhelm them. If we cannot predict them, then we drown them in fire until there is nowhere left to run." And so the Iron Tide unleashed its fury. Hundreds of ships fired at once. Beams of destructive energy crossed the void, converging on the Dauntless. The light was so bright it looked as though a star had been born in the middle of the battlefield. But when the light faded, the Dauntless was gone. "Where?" shouted the Admiral. The answer came seconds later. The Dauntless reappeared right behind the flagship, its weapons already firing. The shot struck the flagship's shield generators, sending shockwaves across its enormous hull. The Empire's pride shuddered, its lights flickering. Gasps echoed through the crew of the flagship. The impossible had happened. The invincible flagship had been hit. On the Dauntless, the crew stared in awe at the sight. For a heartbeat, they allowed themselves a moment of hope. But Kane's voice cut through the silence. "Stay focused. This is only the beginning. They will come harder now." And he was right. The fleet, enraged, turned all attention to the lone human ship. Fighters, cruisers, destroyers, all surged forward in a single mass. The space around the Dauntless filled with deadly light, every path blocked, every escape sealed. Lyra turned to Kane, her face pale. "They're closing in from all sides. If we phase again, we may burn out the engines." Kane did not hesitate. "Then we burn them. This is the moment. Ready the core strike." The crew froze. The core strike was the most dangerous weapon on the Dauntless. It was not a missile, not a cannon, but a burst of unstable energy drawn directly from the ship's own reactor. It could disable entire fleets if timed perfectly, but it could also tear the Dauntless apart if miscalculated. "Commander," Lyra whispered, "if we use it, we may not survive." Kane's gaze was steady, his voice quiet but firm. "If we do nothing, we will not survive anyway." "Prepare the strike," the crew obeyed. Panels lit up, warning alarms blaring. The Dauntless's hull shook as energy built within its reactor. The entire ship groaned as though resisting its own power. The enemy fleet closed in, weapons ready to erase the human ship once and for all. Then, with a voice steady as stone, Kane gave the order. "Release!" The Dauntless unleashed its core strike. A wave of blinding energy burst outward, expanding in every direction. It passed through enemy shields as if they were nothing, reaching deep into their systems. Engines died. Weapons froze. Power cores overloaded. Across the battlefield, Imperial ships went dark. Some drifted powerless, others exploded in silent bursts of fire. The swarm of fighters scattered, their systems failing mid-flight. When the light faded, the impossible was revealed. Hundreds of ships, an entire section of the Iron Tide, lay crippled or destroyed. The battlefield was silent. On the bridge of the flagship, the Admiral stood frozen. His perfect fleet, his invincible Iron Tide, had been torn apart by a single human vessel. And aboard the Dauntless, Kane's crew sat in stunned silence, their hands trembling. They were alive. They had struck the Empire's heart and survived. Kane's voice broke the silence, quiet but resolute. "This is what it means to fight as humans. Not with numbers, not with fear, but with the will to try the impossible." Far across the galaxy, whispers began to spread. Messages carried through hidden channels, spoken in disbelief and wonder. One human ship has broken the Iron Tide. The legend of the Dauntless had begun. The void was silent, but the silence was heavy. The wreckage of hundreds of Imperial ships floated lifelessly, glowing faintly from shattered cores. The once flawless formation of the Iron Tide was broken, its perfect order reduced to chaos. And in the middle of it all, a single human vessel, the Dauntless, stood defiant. No one had ever imagined such a sight. Not the officers aboard the flagship, not the countless soldiers who had sworn loyalty to the Empire, and not even the crew of the Dauntless themselves. They had unleashed a weapon that should have been impossible to use against such numbers. Yet they had survived, and the enemy had fallen. On the Dauntless, Commander Elias Kane stood in silence, his eyes fixed on the display of drifting ships. His crew looked around nervously, unsure whether to feel relief or fear. Lyra, his second officer, finally spoke. "Commander, we did it. We actually broke their fleet." Kane's voice was calm, but his words carried the weight of caution. "No, we broke part of it. They still outnumber us by thousands. The Empire will not run so easily." And Kane was right. On the Imperial flagship, fury burned within the High Admiral. His fleet, the pride of the galaxy, had suffered a wound unlike any in its long history. His officers stood frozen, terrified of speaking. Finally, one young captain dared to whisper, "Admiral, perhaps we should fall back, regroup, and—" The Admiral's hand slammed the console, silencing him instantly. "Retreat?" His voice cut like ice. "The Iron Tide does not retreat. Not for rebels, not for traitors, and certainly not for humans. Double our forces. Surround them. I want that ship reduced to dust." Orders echoed through the surviving vessels. But though the Admiral's tone was filled with pride and rage, his officers could not hide their fear. They had seen the impossible, and doubt now clung to them like shadows. Meanwhile, aboard the Dauntless, Kane studied the movement of enemy ships. He could see it in their maneuvers, the hesitation, the broken coordination. The Empire's strength had always been its discipline, its unshakable order. But now cracks were spreading. "They're not moving like before," Kane said quietly. "They've lost their rhythm." Lyra nodded. "It's fear. They're afraid of us." The idea sounded unbelievable, yet it was true. Across the enemy fleet, whispers spread among crews. Entire ships sent quiet, encrypted messages to one another. "That human ship cannot be hit. Their weapons cut through our shields. Is the Admiral leading us to death?" The Empire had always relied on fear to control others, but now, that same fear was eating its own heart. Kane knew this was his chance. If he could push harder, if he could strike again in the right place, he could turn fear into panic, and panic could destroy even the strongest fleet. "Target their command ships," Kane ordered. "We cut off the head. The body falls." The Dauntless vanished into phase space, reappearing in the center of a cluster of enemy command vessels. Before they could react, the human ship opened fire. Its shots pierced through their control nodes, disabling communication arrays. Officers shouted across broken channels, unable to coordinate. Confusion spread like wildfire. "Commander, they're trying to regroup," Lyra reported. "Don't let them," Kane replied firmly. "Keep moving. Hit them before they can breathe." The Dauntless became a phantom in the battlefield. One moment it was here, the next it was gone, striking from angles no enemy could predict. Each precise attack disabled another piece of the fleet's structure. Without coordination, the Empire's numerical advantage meant nothing. Their size became a weakness, their ships colliding in the chaos. On the flagship, the Admiral's fury grew. He shouted orders, demanded obedience, but the fear had spread too far. Some captains ignored commands, focusing only on survival. Others pulled their ships back, retreating into the void. The Admiral watched in rage as discipline slipped through his fingers. "This is impossible," he muttered, his voice shaking with disbelief. "They are only humans." But the impossible was happening. For the crew of the Dauntless, exhaustion pressed heavily on their shoulders. The phase engines screamed with every jump, threatening to burn out. The drones were running out of resources, adapting slower with each wave. Sparks flew across the bridge, alarms blaring. Yet the humans pressed on. Kane stood firm, his voice steady as ever. "We can't fight forever, but we don't need forever. We only need to break them once. After that, they will destroy themselves." Hours passed, and the battle dragged on. The stars glowed with fire from broken ships, and slowly, the truth became clear. The Iron Tide was collapsing. It was not the human weapons alone that destroyed them. It was the fear, the doubt, the unraveling of their pride. The invincible fleet, once united in perfect order, now fought as scattered pieces, no longer believing in their own strength. At last, the Admiral made a desperate choice. He activated a channel to the Dauntless, his golden eyes burning with pride and hatred. Kane's crew watched as the image of the alien admiral filled their display. Human. The admiral's voice thundered. You think this victory means anything? You are one ship. One. When this battle ends, the Empire will return with 10 fleets. With 100, your kind will burn for daring to defy us. Kane stared at him, his face calm. Then he spoke in a quiet, steady voice. Perhaps, but today, Admiral, your iron tide breaks, and the galaxy will see that even the greatest empire can fall to a single human ship. The channel closed. The Dauntless vanished once more, reappearing behind the flagship. Its weapons fired, striking at the flagship's massive shields. Sparks tore across its black hull and the giant vessel shuddered under the impact. The crew of the flagship felt something they had never felt before. Fear of defeat. Their invincible pride was bleeding. And across the battlefield, countless eyes turned to the Dauntless, a single small vessel standing against thousands. For the first time, soldiers of the Empire whispered not about their own power, but about humanity's defiance. The legend was no longer just beginning. It was spreading, and the iron tide, once the terror of the galaxy, was breaking apart. The battlefield stretched across the stars like a graveyard. Wreckage floated in silence, glowing with dying sparks. The once perfect formation of the Galactic Empire's most powerful fleet, the Iron Tide, was broken. Hundreds of ships burned, thousands drifted without command, and in the heart of this chaos, a single human vessel still moved with purpose, the Dauntless. Inside the human ship, the air was heavy with exhaustion. Sparks flickered along the walls and smoke lingered from overworked systems. The crew had been fighting for hours without rest. Their faces were pale, their hands trembling, but their eyes remained locked on their commander. Commander Elias Kane stood at the center of the bridge, calm as always. His eyes fixed on the main display, where the Imperial flagship towered like a shadow over the ruins. It was the largest warship in the fleet, a giant that symbolized the Empire's unshakable pride. There, Kane said quietly, pointing to the massive vessel. The flagship is the heart of this fleet. If it falls, the Iron Tide dies with it. His words cut through the fatigue, giving his crew strength once more. Lyra, his second officer, swallowed hard. Commander, the flagship is heavily armed. Its shields are stronger than anything we've faced so far. If we attack head-on, we may not survive. Kane nodded slowly. I know, that's why we won't attack head-on. We'll break them from within. The crew looked at him uncertain, but they had learned to trust Kane's voice. Time after time, when survival seemed impossible, he had found a way. The last stand of the Admiral on the Imperial flagship, the High Admiral stood tall despite the storm around him. His golden armor gleamed under the lights of the command deck. Officers rushed about, panicked, their voices filled with fear. But the Admiral's expression was carved from stone. He had sworn that the Empire would never bend. Yet his fleet, his proud Iron Tide, was crumbling before his eyes. And all of it, every failure, every loss, was caused by one human ship. Focus all power on that vessel, the Admiral commanded. I want it destroyed at any cost. The officers obeyed, though their hearts were heavy. Deep down, many wondered if the Admiral was fighting not for victory but for pride. The hunt begins. The Dauntless slipped through the wreckage, weaving between broken ships. Its engines flared as it prepared for the final strike. Target the weak points, Kane ordered. Every giant has a crack. We just need to find theirs. The Dauntless disappeared into phase space, vanishing from enemy sensors. When it reappeared, it struck like lightning, firing directly at the flagship's outer shield. Energy rippled across the massive barrier, bright and furious, but the shield held. The flagship returned fire. Beams of golden light sliced across the stars, each blast powerful enough to tear apart a city. The Dauntless twisted and spun, dodging with impossible precision. But even with skill and speed, the small ship was being pushed to its limits. Shields at 30%, Lyra shouted. We can't take many more hits. Then we don't get hit, Kane replied calmly. The crew tightened their grips on the consoles. They trusted him. Fear turns to fire across the Imperial fleet. Captains watched as the human ship continued its impossible fight. Some wanted to rush to the flagship's aid, but others hesitated. Fear had already hollowed their courage. They saw how one small ship had turned their proud formation into rubble. Now, they began to believe something they never thought possible. The Dauntless could destroy even their flagship. Whispers spread from ship to ship. If the flagship falls, the Iron Tide ends. The Admiral cannot save us. The humans are not weak. What had begun as doubt now burned into fear, and fear soon became despair. Breaking the shield, the Dauntless launched another wave of attacks. This time its weapons focused on a single point of the flagship's shield. Shot after shot struck the same spot, and the barrier began to crack. "Almost there," Kane said, his voice sharp with determination. But the flagship's guns fired again, filling the void with blazing light. The Dauntless shook violently as one blast grazed its hull. Systems flickered, alarms screamed. "We can't take another hit like that," Lyra cried. Kane's jaw tightened. "Then this has to be the last one." He gave the order. The Dauntless charged its weapons to maximum, even beyond safe levels. The ship trembled as if it might tear itself apart. Then with a roar of energy, it fired directly into the weakened point. The flagship's shield shattered like glass. The final blow. The bridge of the flagship erupted in panic. Officers shouted, alarms blared, but the Admiral stood motionless, his golden eyes fixed on the small human vessel that had achieved the unthinkable. "So, it is true," he whispered. "Even giants can fall." The Dauntless reappeared above the flagship, its weapons locked on the exposed hull. "Fire," Kane said. Streams of light cut through the massive vessel. Explosions rippled across its surface, tearing through armor and engines. The flagship groaned like a wounded beast as fire spread across its body. On the command deck, the Admiral stood tall, refusing to flee. He knew the end had come, but he would not bow. As flames engulfed his ship, he whispered his last vow. "The Empire will remember me, but the galaxy will remember them." Moments later, the flagship erupted in a blinding explosion. The tide is broken. Silence followed. Across the battlefield, the remaining Imperial ships froze. The flagship, the heart of the Iron Tide, was gone. Their leader had fallen, and with him their pride. One by one, the surviving ships began to retreat. Some fled into the void, abandoning the fight. Others powered down, surrendering without a word. The greatest fleet the galaxy had ever known was no more. On the Dauntless, the crew stared at the screen in disbelief. They had done the impossible. "It's over," Lyra whispered, her voice trembling. "The Iron Tide is broken." Kane did not smile. He simply nodded. "For now, the Empire still exists. They will come again. But today, we showed them the truth." The birth of a legend. News of the battle spread faster than light. Across distant worlds, whispers grew into stories, and stories became legends. People spoke of the day one human ship faced the Empire's mightiest fleet and triumphed. They spoke of Commander Kane and the Dauntless, of courage against impossible odds. For those who had lived in fear of the Empire, hope was born. If one small ship could break the Iron Tide, then perhaps the Empire was not invincible after all. The galaxy had changed forever, and so the legend of humanity grew. Not because of numbers, not because of power, but because of one truth that could not be denied. Even the greatest empire can fall to the will of the human spirit. The galaxy was vast, filled with countless stars, endless planets, and civilizations older than human history itself. Among all of them, the Galactic Empire stood as the strongest. Its rule stretched across more than half the known galaxy. To most species, the Empire was not just a government, it was a force of nature, a power that could not be resisted. The symbol of the Empire's might was its grand fleet, known across the stars as the Iron Tide. It was a name whispered with fear in marketplaces, in backwater colonies, and even in the halls of rival governments. The Iron Tide was not simply a group of warships. It was an unstoppable armada. The fleet contained thousands of ships, each the size of cities, built with weapons capable of reducing entire planets into lifeless rocks. No battle had ever been lost by the Iron Tide. Every rebellion that rose was crushed. Every enemy that dared to fight was erased from history. To see the fleet in the sky was to know that doom had arrived. For millennia, this had been the way of the galaxy. None had challenged it, and none had survived those who tried. On the edge of the Empire's territory, there was a small human colony on a planet called Erebos 9. The colony was not rich, not powerful, and not even very important in terms of resources. But the people of Erebos 9 had done something unthinkable. They had refused to pay the heavy tribute demanded by the Empire. It was not out of pride, but out of desperation. The taxes had become too high, the demands too cruel. They chose to risk rebellion rather than starve in obedience. The message reached the imperial capital, and within days, the decision was made. The Empire would not tolerate even a small act of disobedience. A single spark, they believed, could lead to a fire of resistance. To prevent that, they sent the strongest answer possible, the Iron Tide itself. The Armada moved like a storm across space. Massive carriers, heavy destroyers, sleek cruisers, and endless swarms of fighters gathered together. Each ship was a masterpiece of alien engineering, polished and perfected after thousands of years of war. At the center of it all was the flagship, a vessel so massive it could be seen from orbit with the naked eye. Its hull was forged from black metal that reflected no light, and its weapons glowed with destructive energy. It was said to hold enough power to split a planet in half. When the news spread that the Iron Tide was on its way, fear gripped the entire region. Neighboring colonies packed their belongings and fled into deep space. Merchants closed their trade routes. Even local governors from other worlds sent urgent messages to the humans: surrender before it was too late. But Erebos 9 had no choice. They could not pay. They could not run. And so they prepared for the end. Yet not all humans believed the battle was already lost. Far away from the colony, in the silent blackness of space, a single human vessel waited. Compared to the grand ships of the Empire, this craft was small, almost fragile. From a distance, it looked like an ordinary ship, plain and simple in design. But inside, it carried secrets that would change the galaxy forever. This ship was called the Dauntless. The Dauntless was not part of any large human fleet, because humanity did not possess such fleets. Their colonies were scattered, their technology far less advanced than the ancient empires that surrounded them. But what they lacked in numbers and size, they made up for with creativity. Humans were builders, thinkers, survivors. They did not rely on tradition. They invented. They adapted. They dared to test the impossible. The commander of the Dauntless was Elias Kane, a man who had spent his entire life in the quiet corners of human space. He was not a famous war hero. He was not born into power or privilege, but he carried within him the same spirit that had always driven humanity forward: the refusal to kneel, even when the enemy was stronger. As the Iron Tide closed in on Erebos 9, Kane stood at the bridge of his ship. Around him, his crew worked silently, their faces pale but determined. Each of them knew the truth. The Dauntless was all that stood between the Empire's wrath and the survival of their people. No other reinforcements would come. Humanity's scattered colonies had no armies, no powerful allies. If the Dauntless failed, Erebos 9 would burn, and the message to the rest of humanity would be clear: resistance was hopeless. The crew of the Dauntless had no illusions. Their ship was small, and the fleet they faced was beyond imagination. But Kane carried a weapon the Empire had never faced before. Not a super laser, not a massive cannon, but something far more dangerous: a mind willing to try the impossible. The Dauntless had been outfitted with experimental technologies developed in secret human research stations. These were inventions considered unstable, even reckless. Other species would have dismissed them as untested foolishness. But humanity had never survived by playing safe. They had always gambled everything when pushed against the wall. The ship's engines could bend space in ways the Empire had never imagined, allowing the Dauntless to vanish and reappear in sudden bursts. Its weapons were not built for brute force, but for precision, devices designed to bypass shields, drones that could adapt in the middle of battle, and energy bursts that targeted systems instead of hulls. The Dauntless was not a hammer. It was a scalpel, and Kane intended to use it where it hurt the most. Still, as he stared out at the distant stars, Kane knew the truth. They were only one ship against thousands. The odds were beyond reason. Yet something inside him refused to surrender to despair. Humanity had always been underestimated, always dismissed as weak by the great empires of the galaxy. Perhaps that was their strength. No one ever expected them to fight back. As the Iron Tide drew closer, Kane gave a quiet order: "Prepare the ship." "We are not running." The crew obeyed without question. Their hands moved over the controls, their voices calm but firm. Each of them knew what was at stake. They were not just fighting for Erebos 9. They were fighting for the right of humanity to exist without chains. Far away, on the command deck of the Empire's flagship. The High Admiral of the Iron Tide watched as reports came in. His golden eyes narrowed at the mention of a lone human ship standing in their path. He let out a cold laugh. One ship? Is this their defense? Then let us make an example so perfect that no other world dares defy us again. And so, the greatest fleet in galactic history moved forward, certain of its victory. But in the quiet black of space, the Dauntless waited, and humanity's fight for survival was about to begin.